We've all seen the ads on social media. Own a house for the cost of a cup of coffee a week. Massive growth area, make thousands a week, develop for profit. You know what I mean? You've seen them. How do you work out who to trust and who to run a mile from?
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for home buyers who want to get it right.
I'm Meighan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. And that's a good thing because between us, we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories and avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on.
We've got loads of free tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au. There you'll get access to our free webinar, How to Buy Your First Home with the Right Amount of Debt. You'll also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to be educated home buyers. We have created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, here's the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority or your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today we're talking about property spruikers, how to spot them and how to work out who you can trust. But before we get into that, there is a special house behind Meighan in the video this week.
Continuing my fun with Airbnb's OMG category. This is a yellow submarine that you can stay in just across the ditch in New Zealand. How fun does that look? Claustrophobic to me. I probably am not that keen to get in it, but I like more windows myself.
That's exactly what it looks like, claustrophobic. Do you know, have you ever been in a submarine?
I have not.
I have, at the War Museum.
Really?
And I can honestly tell you, when I went in there, I was like, hell, this would be hell. And so I like a window. I think a window is a good thing to have in a property. And you are, like, these people are down there for months and the conditions are cramped. And the thing vibrates the whole time as well. And there's just constant noise and no window. So I would highly recommend not.
It's an amazing mindset to be able to cope with that kind of environment.
It's incredible. Anyway, all right. Well, that looks like fun. If you're up for it, go and just stay in one over there in New Zealand. Do not buy one.
Yeah. Probably not easy to price.
Probably not easy to sell either if you get to live in a submarine. Alrighty, so we've got a topic that's both intriguing and cautionary today, property spookers. So what is a property spooker, Meighan? Should we start off with that?
Let's do that. So they're individuals or organisations who often promise to make you rich through real estate, sometimes investment, sometimes your own home. But the reality sometimes can be a long way from what's advertised. So in this episode, what we're going to cover is the truth behind property spruikers, learn how to identify their tactics, and provide you with tools to protect yourself from falling into potential traps. So let's kick it off.
Yes. With property is a challenging, difficult thing to get your head around. It's complex, right? And apart from the fact that you've got to save for a hell of a lot of time before you can get into the property market in the first place, then you've got decisions around finance, you've got decisions around what to buy, where to buy, how much to pay. So many things to worry about. And in life, human beings, we like to go the easy option.
Oh, yeah. Give it to me on a plate.
Yeah. If someone's going to give me a silver bullet, oh, great. I don't have to go and do the work. I don't have to go and do the hard thing and work out what's right, what's wrong, blah, blah, blah. And that's where spruikers can be so dangerous because spruikers are just highly, highly polished salespeople with great marketing spin.
Yep.
And they can break things down to make it sound so easy, a bit like buying an investment property for a price of a coffee a day. oh, great, that's easy. No word of how long term will it do its job as an investment for you. We're not worried about that. We're just worried about the easy bit.
But it promises this sort of long-term financial freedom as well. And I think that's the thing that feels really attractive is somebody has packaged this up for me and they're handing it to me on a silver platter. I'm crazy not to do it. Well, no, you're not. You're crazy to question whether you should do it.
No, you're not crazy if you question whether you should do it. You're just crazy if you just do it without questioning it.
Oh, can we go back? What did I say? You're crazy.
You're crazy if you question it. You're not.
You're crazy. Don't question it is what I meant to say.
Should we leave this little edit in? Or are we just confusing people?
You're crazy if you don't question it. Question it.
You're crazy if you don't question it. And the good thing is that I was listening to you, so I could go, hang on a minute, that's not what you meant to say. Right. So property spruikers are notorious for pushing buyers into quick decisions. Right. They really use those high pressure sales tactics and glossy marketing materials, and that without actually providing comprehensive information. And they're classic when you talk about high growth area, and they can talk about, evidence of property prices rising in these areas. And it's like the data they're using isn't actually untrue. It's just that they're actually lying with statistics because they're using the statistics often in a way that isn't technically correct. It's like the data is true, what they're saying is true, but how they're applying it isn't. And I'll give you an example.
That's the interpretation of statistics, isn't it? Because you can interpret statistics in all sorts of different, the same statistic can be interpreted in all sorts of different ways depending how you choose to use it.
And, I read this book that Kent Lardner, who's, one of my favorite property data people, and he said to me, you got to read this book. It was written in 1954 and it's called How to Lie with Statistics. And it's so educational, right? And I'll give you just one little example. A lot of people, particularly with house and land packages, and right, this is something that's really offered to a lot of first home buyers. And, and they dangle the big carrot of all the government incentives, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there's a lot of property spruikers in this space, and they all sound like they're helping you. But the problem is that, are they really, right? And one of the things that they will talk about is a high growth area. And I love it when I see this. When I say I love it, I hate it at the same time. And that is they talk about prices in this area have, been doubling or going up at this huge percentage. And when I go and look at the data and go, wow, that's an incredible statistic. Is that true? And I go and look at the data and I have found this in a number of different areas. And this is where they've redeveloped areas where they've knocked down older homes on bigger blocks of land, or they've basically ripped up market gardens, and they've bought properties that were previously sort of acreage, and then they've been able to subdivide into much smaller lots. Those individual properties sold for a lot of money because they were development sites. And it showed as huge growth because when it was just a home on a big block of land, it was not worth as much until it was rezoned and you could build a lot more on it. And then it had a massive increase in value. So that's where the actual increase of value came from, was from a rezoning, which allowed people to then turn into a development site. And so technically that's true. This area has had a massive growth in value. But that doesn't mean that all these little tiny houses built on little tiny blocks of land are going to increase in the same way, because the reason they had that increase in value was a rezoning change. It was a change in zoning, not because this house, this brand new house that you're going to buy is going to do the same thing. And so that's where they're not technically lying.
Yep.
But the application of that statistic is completely and utterly inaccurate when it comes to what you're going to buy in that area.
It is true, Veronica, and they can back up some of these claims with statistics. But if you, as you say, if you actually lift up the hood and look underneath and start to delve a bit deeper, also what can be happening is that the old statistic might be based on your average kind of townhouse, bit unrenovated, that general established older home. And then when you start selling new homes on a block of land, they generally are sold at a higher price, for a premium price, actually. So that big growth, that big kick in the median house price is artificial until you start to have a look at the resale of those new houses down the track. That's when you start to get a better understanding of how that area is actually performing. What you've had is simply a change in the nature, the structure of the property types that are in that particular area. It doesn't tell you that prices are rising. What you really want to look at is what happens when those resell down the track. Do they resell at a higher price, or do they resell at a much lower price? And that's, I think, what's really dangerous. It's really, really dangerous.
Such a good example. Some years ago when I started learning about all this, and we're probably talking about 15 years ago now, and I was looking at apartments in Sydney and areas which had experienced great growth. And at the time, Alexandria came out as one of the suburbs with the biggest median apartment growth rate. And I was like, wow, what's happening in Alexandria? And I started looking at it. It was like, well, it was all these, and it's still happening now, let me tell you. There were all these, it was like the first generation of rezoning of industrial land to apartments. And so there were some old apartment buildings in there, but they were like, your red brick 3-story walk-up types, the odd one around. And then all of a sudden you're getting these large modern complexes. And of course, those apartments, brand new, were selling at a premium, exactly that. So that growth was artificial because you weren't comparing the same properties. It wasn't, you were comparing an egg with an apple. It wasn't even the same variety. It wasn't even the same type of food.
It's a different animal altogether.
Different animal, a different beast.
All right. Well, let's help everybody. Let's being aware of red flags is really, really important. So let's delve into some common warning signs that could indicate that you're dealing with a property spruiker.
Yeah, because of course you've got to remember that these are salespeople, right? Their goal is to make a sale. Their goal is not to help you make financial success. You're done. You've signed up. You bought your property. They're off to the next one.
And they get a very good commission for that sale too.
They do. All care, no responsibility.
Yep.
Right. So the promise of high guaranteed returns, red flag. Nobody can promise any return.
If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Just take off the rose-colored glasses and have a think. Is this really so far above what's happening in the real world that I really need to step back and question whether these promises can actually come to fruition?
Another one too is like that lack of transparency in terms of property details or sales examples of really very close comparables for argument's sake, or market trends or potential risks. I love the graphs. They show a lovely upward curve, but there's no numbers on the graph. Like, have you ever seen those charts? Look for evidence.
Where's the detail? Yeah.
And then be critical about that evidence.
And I think, look, I want to go back to that very last thing that you said in that warning sign, that red flag, which is not talking about potential risks, because anybody who really cares about people in property, in investment, in real estate, they are going to tell you the good and the bad because they want you to go into, it's like us, like we're constantly saying this is not risk-free. Buying a property is not risk-free. There are risks associated. It's about understanding what those risks are and then making well-informed decisions to see if that sits comfortably within your risk profile. But if you're sitting in a seminar or sitting in front of someone who's spruiking a particular property and say, this is guaranteed to go up, red flag. You'll never lose here, red flag. The best opportunity you'll ever have in your lifetime, red flag. That's a sales pitch. And the product is you because they're selling to you. Yeah, the property might be the thing that you buy, but they're not giving you advice and they're not telling you about the risks.
Especially if they've false scarcity is another thing that they'll say. One of the things that cracks me up is like, this is an off-market opportunity to buy off the plan. Because they weren't really going to sell that.
Or everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and then they do, some of the launches of these new developments are, they're professionally put on to create FOMO. And you got people falling over themselves to sign up for properties. You say, hang on a minute, hang on. Step back. Let's critically evaluate this. Better still, critically evaluate before you go to any of these events. But there's a lot of seminar events for first home buyers that are designed to really just get you all tumbling into a house and land or even in apartments, and the sense that, if you don't get in now, you're going to miss out without, as Meighan said, talking about the risks, but also the evidence. There's so much evidence that people are more likely to lose money on brand new properties than they are on established properties. And not to say you're always going to make money on established either. Like, we do bang on about risks here, but the risks of brand new are much greater, vastly greater than they are on established. And yet in these seminars, they've got the budgets to create really great pitches because they make so much money out of selling this stuff.
They're selling each one.
There's huge commissions to be gained. So you've got to be very, very careful.
And there's a defined number of them. So they have an outcome to achieve. And that's something to think about as well. Whatever's in the development or the land release, that's the number they've got to sell. There's not more that they've got to sell. They're going to move on to their next product as soon as those are sold. But they have targets to meet. They have the developers they're working for have holding costs that they want to minimise. So the quicker they can get these sales done, the quicker they get the commission in their pockets, and the quicker the developer moves on to the next project. So just be aware of that. If there isn't really clear, balanced information in a seminar or when you're talking to a salesperson and a spruiker potentially, then the red flag is you're not getting both sides of the story. You need to step away, get out of that excitement phase, because it is exciting and you get really wound up, and a really good salesperson will take you on an emotional journey that starts you at the point of skepticism and takes you to the point of, I cannot walk away until I've signed that.
Sign me up.
Yeah, and that is a good salesperson. It's not a good property advisor though, and it certainly isn't necessarily a good property deal. So yeah, take those rose colours. Always take a breath. Never sign anything when you're standing in front of a salesperson for the first time, because you don't want to be the product of a spruiker who goes home and goes, you should have seen what I did today, and almost crows about it. Got these people to sign on the spot.
You got to give yourself some personal boundaries. If you are going to go to any of these seminars, I'll just say don't go to them. But, if you are going to go to any of them or find yourself in the presence of someone you think, oh, God, this feels a bit pressured. It feels a bit well, like a well-oiled machine. There's something niggling away at you that you're not really 100% convinced. At the same time, you feel the pull. You feel that you're getting pulled along because there's a lot of behavioral biases they're tapping into to try to get you to make a decision. And so it's good to go to these things and absolutely set a boundary for yourself to say, I will not make a decision on anything unless I've had 24 hours to think about it. And I'm going to research the spruiker, the developer, the location, the whatever you're going to do. Set some personal boundaries to protect yourself. Have you got any examples, maybe a personal example, Meighan?
Years ago, before I was in the industry, I was lured into a seminar promising huge profits in a short time by purchasing in mining town. Now, as I say, this is before I was involved in property, so we're talking 20 plus years ago. The presenter used enormous pressure tactics, and whilst I didn't end up investing in a property, I guess I was skeptical enough that I looked at it and I went, it just seems too good to be true. And what was happening in Queensland at the time, and there's been a lot of legislative changes to deal with this, but what was happening in these seminars was people were put in a room and they almost were not allowed to leave this room until they had been through an entire process. So I sort of got to the point where I was like, yeah, this is not for me, I had to leave. And I was moved into another room to continue the sales process.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, what they were doing was they had the sales pitch there, they had a conveyancer there, and they had a mortgage broker there. They also had a valuer there. So what they were doing was providing an end-to-end risk management process, if you like, so that you would feel as a buyer, well, everything's above board here because that solicitor's going to give me the right advice. And that valuer, they're going to tell me if it's not worth that. So it was almost like they had absolutely packed in this spruiking 101 in Queensland 20 years ago. They had the full package there so that you actually ended up with no objections at the end. They had covered every objection that you possibly could. And at the end of it, you almost felt like if I don't do this, I'm the idiot. And that was such a dangerous and incredibly emotionally and intellectually manipulative environment to be in, because you felt like these people are looking after me.
Yeah. And even though, look, you can still get one-stop shops. There's plenty of one-stop shops out there that will stitch you up effectively. And so, and even though, in our businesses, we will recommend, conveyancers, we will recommend a mortgage broker, we'll recommend people, but we're not in business with them all.
No, and we're also not trying to get you to do a particular thing, which is sign a contract.
Yes.
It's got to be independent.
So you almost fell for it. How did you get out of it?
Oh, I just didn't. I said, I'm not buying this. In fact, I have so many questions about this whole process. I don't see how this could actually be legal. And it's funny, it wasn't very long after that because there was no cooling off periods back then. So not long after, it was only a few years after that they started to, the Queensland government started to realise that these pressure tactics were putting people were paying $100, $500 to put a contract on a property that they couldn't get out of. There was no out because they'd had the independent legal advice from the solicitor that was there at the seminar. So that's when cooling off periods were actually brought into Queensland. But, me personally, it was just simply, I'm not buying it. So you might as well open the door and let me out. It's not going to happen.
Otherwise I'll start heckling and then other people won't buy.
I just kept saying, it just sounds too good to be true. It just sounds too good to be true. I just kept saying, it just sounds too good to be true. And the answer from the Spruiker is, it is.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm a natural cynic. I do err to know before I err to yes. I know. But I have felt the lure of things like that myself. And that questioning yourself thing. Am I missing a trick here? Am I missing something? Is it? And that's very dangerous because even as a natural cynic or a natural contrarian, I'll say I'm not that cynic. I'm actually more optimistic than a cynic, but I am contrarian. Even if I can feel that pull, then someone who's not as naturally contrarian as me, then you can see how people get lured into it. Now it's great laws have changed, and there's certainly across the country there's fair trading is stepped in many cases to stop a lot of really poor practices, but it doesn't change the fact that there's a lot of sophistication around the marketing of some of these schemes, and there are still property spruikers out there, and spruiking itself is not illegal, right? Also, and they are salespeople. Some of them are real estate agents, so there's certain, I guess, legislation that governs their behaviour there. And obviously there's the Office of Fair Trading does step in with regards to certain things as well. But the problem is with property is that when you make these decisions, you might have a cooling off period, but within that cooling off period, even then you've got sunk costs because you've already committed, and to uncommit is harder than if you hadn't committed in the first place. But also the idea is with property is that it is a long game, as we are always on about. It's hard to know that it's not a good decision until time has passed.
Yeah.
And so what we're saying is if you feel that you're being manipulated, if you feel that you're responding to something without the full information, or that the information is skewed in a way that you're not getting the full picture and then potentially misusing statistics and data, even with a cooling off period, you've got to be very careful.
Oh, good advice. I was just thinking also, sometimes in these seminars, there are people planted to create a feeling of positivity towards saying yes. And you can actually see them if you're sitting in the seminars and someone sort of looks a bit laid back and relaxed and they're nodding and putting their hands up and asking questions that really in hindsight are quite well planted and leading.
They're
questions.
Encouraging them to sell in the answer.
Yeah.
Or it sounds like an objection, but, because quite often they'll raise the objections that you're thinking, yeah, I want to know that too. And then they give a really convincing answer and that person looks convinced and you go, oh, okay, then it's all right.
Yeah. And you see someone who's been put in there to move from I'm skeptical and I don't believe this to, wow, this is really something I want to do. Yes, sign me up. They're often people who have been put there and they are in the process of being part of the sales machine, that is to get you to sign on the dotted line. So that's another red flag to look out for is and agents when they say, we've already sold a quarter of the properties. Now, that makes you feel like, oh, other people have thought this is a good thing, so maybe it is a good thing. That feeling that there's some sort of confirmation there that what you're thinking might be okay, but other people think it's okay, so it must be okay.
Social proof.
That's a good point. Yeah, social proof. That's the term I was looking for. But if you dig in, sometimes those properties have been purchased by entities related to the developer. So they've been able to show some sales and to set the price. So we've often looked back at developments and looked at the early sales and said, oh, we know that those companies are in business together, or that is a related company to the directors of that one. That's how they've set the price. We need to ignore that price because that is completely irrelevant. So some of those early sales, just be really careful who those sales have been to. And even, if you're feeling confident, say, were they sold to a related entity to set the price? Because they are in some cases.
They absolutely are. I mean, some years ago, one of my team was doing an evaluation on a property. I won't say the suburb, but it was a beachside suburb of Sydney, and it was an apartment. And the client already owned one in the building, and he wanted to buy the one next door, and he wanted to punch a hole through the wall and turn it into a bigger apartment, right? The agent had been telling him this certain price per square meter, and he was thinking, oh, that seems a little high, but not impossible because of what he'd already paid for his one. When we looked in the building, in the actual building he was in, and we could see that the first sale of that building set a new price record for the suburb, which he matched when he bought his. We found out by a little digging that it was to an auntie of the developer. So it was a related party that sold to set a new price record, which then this person went and bought the first one on the back of that. This person was a CEO of quite a significant business. He was no slouch, this guy. And then he came to us for some, for some advice on buying the next one. And we went, man, you've already overinvested in that building. And, no other building had been sold at that same dollar per square meter since. And I mean, like, if you match that, you're matching your own overpayment based on a related sale. So, it was, and he was arguing with us even, like, because he was like trying to justify that he hadn't overpaid. And we're like, well, you give us the evidence then, because you've engaged us to advise you, and we've discovered something that's a bit hard to swallow. But so that's just one example, but there are loads and loads of examples.
Yeah, the other is rebates, Veronica. So to set a price in a complex or in a subdivision, sometimes to get the contract price to a certain level, the developer will rebate the buyer. So let's say, for example, it's $500,000. It might actually really only be worth $450,000, but that developer wants that sale price to be shown at $500,000, so they'll rebate that first buy, the $50,000, as a reward for getting in early or being one of the first, or whatever the case may be. Now, there's no way of finding out whether these rebates happen except to ask the direct question, and hope that you're dealing with someone who has the honesty to tell you. And we certainly have asked those direct questions in the past. But rebates mean that the contract price, the price that the valuers are using, they might question it because it doesn't look right, but that's the contract price that is recorded. And be very careful that you're not paying that you're paying, you're comparing to what the rebated price was, which is the $450, not $500.
Actually, you just raise a good point there too, because valuers typically won't use sale prices of brand new property when we're evaluating a property. So, with an apartment, for instance. So if there's a brand new building, there's off the plan sales in it, and they're doing evaluation on something else, another unit in the suburb that it's an established property, they won't include those off the plan sales as comparables because it's well known that they're quite often inflated. So that in itself is just a little bit of market intel that's worthwhile being aware of. So how can you protect yourself from property spruikers? We've got a few points here for you.
First, do your own research. Don't believe what you're sold. So don't ever rely solely on the information provided by the agent, the marketer, the spruiker in this case. Verify market trends, look at property values, and look carefully at potential risks independent of the information that you've been given. We always say anything an agent tells us is rumour until we prove it otherwise. So, and that's a good level of skepticism. That's not to say don't believe what you're told, but go on and independently verify it.
Well, it's basically fact checking, isn't it? And so this is the thing: if they're making claims, fact check them. And it's funny because a lot of, it's one of those things. You'll hear a lot of people in the property space to go. And so, what are the tips for first home buyers? Okay, do your research, and then that's all they say. Yeah. And what we're saying is, do your research, but this is what you need to do. This is the research you need to do. And so, everything that we say to you want to be actionable and something valuable. So, second thing you can do,
take your time. Don't feel rushed.
Don't rush. No.
Do not rush. Do not feel when someone says to you, well, this deal's only available tonight. Okay. I bet it's available tomorrow. It's not just going to be a one-time thing. Because if they've still got other things to sell, the opportunity is going to be there. So don't feel pressured to sign until you've been able to take a deep breath, calm yourself, think logically and outside of the influence of those who are selling, and just take those independent steps to verify. In the course, we show you how to do the due diligence. In your first home buyer guide, we show you how to do the due diligence independently, taking information from all sorts of sources and then understanding how that impacts the particular property that you're looking at. You can do that independently, and you can do it pretty quickly too. Like, we're not talking weeks to evaluate, do the due diligence to evaluate. Also, with your pricing, step back, take a breath. Don't be swayed by what other things have sold that have been given to you as evidence of value. Step back and have a look at it yourself and get some of that independent information.
100%. And you know what? A classic one too, that if they're pressuring you and you think, hang on a minute, how unique is this, inverted commas, opportunity, really? Here's a little hack for you. Look on Google Maps or the satellite, right? And just sort of zoom out a little bit and think, oh, how many new suburbs could potentially be created right next to the new suburb I'm looking at right now? So, or if you're looking back to my Alexandria example, that's in Sydney, that's an area where there's there's still a lot of industrial sites, left to be turned into apartments, or Marriottville. There's lots of areas where you just have to be careful to think, oh, how scarce is this really? Really? Different if you're buying a harbourside apartment. There's only a few of those.
Yeah.
But the Spruikers don't sell stuff that's scarce, right? Because stuff that's truly scarce doesn't need the high pressure tactics, but stuff that's not really scarce, it does need the high pressure tactics.
Oh, that's good advice.
Taking your time. It is, isn't it? I just came up with that.
That's beautiful. I love it. Remember, it's your hard-earned money. You're in control. Don't let somebody else control you. Now, an exception to that is if you are working with a buyer's agent that you've engaged to work on your behalf, then they should be, and they're qualified, they're experienced, they're licensed, they're members of REBA, the association, PIPA. If you've engaged people to work on your behalf, then there's a level of trust that you need to have that you don't need to independently verify and question. By all means, ask questions, but that is a very different relationship and a very different level of professionalism to a salesperson selling you something. So I just want to differentiate between those two groups.
Good point. I mean, it really does come down to who's paying them, So you're paying them, then they are advising you. If somebody else is paying them, then they're selling a product or a service. Okay, so do we have any legal measures in place to protect investors from property spruikers or first-home buyers from property spruikers?
Look, there are.
To a degree.
There is legislation about what you can and can't do. There's, as I said, the cooling off period was introduced to give people the ability to breathe after they'd been put in these high pressure situations. So the Office of Fair Trading in each state, they are the regulatory body for these sorts of things. In many jurisdictions, property spruikers who engage in deceptive practices can face legal consequences. But you've got to know what those deceptive practices are to make the complaint to be able to get a remedy. So if you've signed a contract and they've kind of done all the right things around that process, but you've got information or you believed information that you haven't independently verified, then you may not have coverage. So you've got to be really careful still that you're stepping back. Don't just rely on legislation to protect you from yourself. You are the person who is in control of your decisions, and you have every opportunity to stop, breathe, step back. Don't let the pressure of a sales tactic or a spruiker force you into a decision that you shouldn't be making, or that you should be questioning or getting independent advice around.
It's really important. And the reality is that a lot of these developers or spruikers, sometimes they can set up a company and then they do a phoenix as well. So, by the time you sort of worked it out, they might not even be around. So, that's so you don't want to be relying on that, because and who wants to go down that path anyway? Alrighty. So what's really important is that you be cautious. This is something to actually take seriously and not look for a shortcut, right? So being cautious, being well informed, and understanding always, follow the money trail. Why am I being sold this or told this? Who is really making the money out of this? Fact check, and really just, if in doubt, don't.
Yeah. Oh, love it.
If in doubt, don't. Now, if you've got more topics or questions on this topic that you'd like us to cover in these podcasts as well, just feel free, send us an email. Say hello, support@homebuyeracademy.com.au.
Fabulous.
In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out your first home buyer guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.